You arrive in New York City on a cold October morning in 1907. The air smells of coal smoke and panic, and newspapers scream about collapsing banks and ruined fortunes. You read headlines that promise ruin, and you feel the country teetering. The moment feels like a turning point that will rewrite the rules of American finance. You need to understand what built this crisis before you understand the rescue. America in 1907 had booming industry, fast credit, and no central bank to act as lender of last resort. The absence of a central authority meant that private institutions could become crisis managers almost by accident. You are watching a network of trusts and speculators that pushed leverage to dangerous heights. Men like F. Augustus Hines and other rogue operators used risky railroad and copper plays to magnify returns and occasionally destroy rivals. Those private schemes left the system brittle, waiting only for a small shock to ripple outward into catastrophe. You find the trigger in a small corner of the markets, and you realize how quickly fear spreads. The failed attempt to corner United Copper in early October 1907 revealed a fragile chain of promises and margin calls that could not be honored. Once United Copper collapsed, it set off a series of bank runs that no single institution could ignore. You read about the Knickerbocker Trust run on the 22nd of October 1907, and you feel the panic intensify. Charles T. Barney, president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, watched depositors queue up and demand their cash, and the bank quickly failed to meet the outflows. When Knickerbocker collapsed, confidence evaporated and New York banks teetered on the edge of systemic failure. You see the contagion spread across the financial district like a fast fire slipping from roof to roof. Stock prices plunged, clearinghouses hesitated, and brokers faced margin calls that could not be met without immediate capital. The absence of a central lender meant that each institution looked to its peers, and the result was fear, paralysis, and runs. You look for help from Washington, and you see that the federal government had very limited tools in its hands. President Theodore Roosevelt was in office in the Treasury under George B. Cortelyou, had some gold reserves, but no mechanism to inject liquidity systematically. The White House could advise, but it could not act with the speed or discretion required to stop the runs. You are introduced to the most powerful banker in America, J.P. Morgan, and you understand why attention turned to him. John Pierpont Morgan stood at the apex of American finance, with connections across banks, railroads, and government circles that rivaled any public office. When private actors could not arrange calm, people looked to Morgan as the only person who might do so. You walk with him to his library at 23 Wall Street, a room few had known the power of until that October. The library was ornate, lined with books, and dominated by an oak table that could seat the most influential bankers in America. People called it the room where deals were made and national outcomes determined, and history would remember it as a kind of private command center. You have heard the story of the lock on the library door, and it is almost mythic in its drama. On the 23rd of October and 24, 1907, J.P. Morgan gathered the top bankers and reportedly kept them until they produced a solution to the runs. The ritual of closing the door symbolized authority, and it forced men to broker a deal in a confined room with little escape. You imagine the conversation inside that library, and you see Morgan demanding commitments with an iron tone. Henry P. Davison, Thomas W. Lamont, James Stillman, and George F. Baker, among others, were present, and they had to pledge funds and cooperation. Morgan used reputation, leverage, and threat to compel action, because the alternative was total collapse and ruin. You realize the first step was the creation of a private liquidity pool to stop the runs immediately. Morgan persuaded leading bankers to commit an initial fund of roughly $25 million to shore up trust companies, and the pledge gave market participants a throat to breathe through. That sum was not the final figure, but it was a decisive psychological barrier against panic. You follow how Morgan negotiated specific rescues through personal influence and private deals. He leaned on his partners and on rival financiers until they agreed to provide credit lines and take over troubled assets. When organized liquidity appeared, depositors slowly stopped running and the frantic sell orders found fewer buyers, easing immediate pressure. You watch the market stabilize and you feel a strange relief as panic recedes over several days. Once Morgan and his syndicate committed resources, confidence began to trickle back into the market and interbank lending resumed. The immediate collapse was averted, but the cure was private and dramatic, and that raised broader questions about power and accountability. You sense public fury gathering because the rescue was arranged out of sight and by private hands. Newspapers accused Morgan of being above the law and of owning too much influence over economic fate. The spectacle of financiers dictating national outcomes created a political sensation that would not fade when the immediate danger passed. You watch Washington respond to the outrage by convening the National Monetary Commission in 1908, and you see the seeds of reform. Senator Nelson W. Aldrich led the commission in a comprehensive investigation of money and banking across the Atlantic. The report they produced laid intellectual groundwork for a centralized system that could prevent private rescues from becoming the default crisis solution. You follow the path from commission to legislation, and you find a sequence of compromises. The Aldrich Plan met political resistance because of fears about private bankers controlling national money, and reformers pushed back demanding public oversight. After years of debate, negotiation, and a new administration, the Federal Reserve Act was drafted, amended, and eventually passed. You mark the 23rd of December 1913 as a turning point when the Federal Reserve Act became law across America. The Federal Reserve System formalized the idea of a central lender of last resort and created 12 regional reserve banks to stabilize currency and credit. The law did not erase private banks, but it created public mechanisms to contain and manage systemic risk more transparently. You note the irony that J.P. Morgan did not live long to see the Fed fully in place. Morgan died on the 31st of March, 1913, which was painfully close to the law that would change the banking landscape forever. He left behind a banking empire and a public debate about the balance between private clout and public responsibility that would endure for generations. You examine how Morgan's death accelerated consolidation and professionalization inside big banks that followed his model. The firm passed into the hands of partners and sons who institutionalized practices that Morgan once directed personally. Banking power modernized. And many of the personal levers he had used were replaced by corporate governance and larger regulatory frameworks. You compare Morgan as private firewall to later public rescues, and you see an uncomfortable continuity. In 2008, the U.S. government enacted a $700 billion troubled asset relief program to stabilize banks and credit markets. And the rhetoric changed, but not always the outcome. The question of who pays and who decides during a panic remained strikingly similar across a century. You ask yourself whether the moral hazard born in 1907 returns stronger in 2008, and you cannot find an easy answer. When institutions expect rescue, they may take greater risks and push systemic danger onto the public. Regulators and historians therefore argue that legislative reforms, capital requirements, and stress testing are necessary to counterbalance private incentives that once allowed Morgan to save America by taking extraordinary control. You face the philosophical dilemma that emerges from these crises about power and responsibility. Should one man have the capacity to decide whether a nation lives or fails during a financial storm? Or should that power rest in accountable public institutions? The answer shapes law, commerce, and democracy, and it is the thread that ties 1907 to our current debates about banking and society. You imagine alternative histories where Morgan was absent, and you feel the fragility of outcomes that hinge on personalities. If private bankers had not pooled funds, or if Morgan had refused to act, the panic might have cascaded into deeper economic depression. That hypothetical underscores both the improvised heroism and the systemic risk of relying on unaccountable individuals. You weigh the political response that sought to prevent future private rescues, and you see why reform gathered momentum. A Federal Reserve represented a collective decision to institutionalize a lender of last resort, away from single-person discretion. That choice redistributed power, but it did not eliminate the influence of large banking institutions over finance and politics. You consider the human story beneath the institutional facts, and you hear the contradictions. J.P. Morgan was ruthless to rivals and merciful to the national system when it suited him, and history remembers him both as savior and oligarch. The duality of his legacy is a mirror for how societies balance private talent and public good when crises arrive. You confront modern parallels where private firms again become quasi-public actors during crises. Government and central banks coordinate massive interventions in markets today, often citing systemic risk and national interest. The mechanisms have changed since 1907, but the core problem remains the governance of financial power and the social cost of failure. You feel the tension between efficiency and accountability that has animated policy debates since Morgan's era. Centralized crisis management can act decisively and save the system, yet it can also shelter powerful actors from consequences and encourage risky behavior. The policy trade-offs are political decisions that will define the shape of capitalism for generations. You listen to the lessons from 1907, and you ask how they should change modern regulations today. Transparency, higher capital buffers, and clear legal frameworks for emergency lending are frequently proposed, and many jurisdictions adopted those measures after 2008, yet even with rules. The unpredictability of markets means that moral hazard and concentrated influence remain persistent twin problems. You close the circle by thinking about trust, legitimacy, and power in finance, and you arrive at a sober conclusion. J.P. Morgan did save America in a single dramatic episode. But his solution also revealed the dangers of private power over public lifelines. The creation of the Federal Reserve was a public answer, yet it was born from fear and private improvisation rather than deliberate, democratic planning. You end with a question that should echo in every banking debate you hear from now on. Do you want your system to be saved by invisible private hands in an oak-paneled room? Or would you prefer clear rules, public oversight, and accountability when the next panic arrives? That question will shape policy, politics, and the distribution of risk for decades to come. You find the story of 1907 both a warning and a parable for our present moment. It teaches that heroism in finance can be both necessary and dangerous, and it warns that systems structured around private rescues create fragile foundations as you watch modern bailouts and central bank interventions. Recall the locked library and decide where you stand on power and responsibility. You are invited to keep thinking and to join a conversation that never really ends. If this story gave you a new perspective on banking, regulation, or the balance between public and private authority, do subscribe for more history and analysis. Tell us in the comments whether you think J.P. Morgan was a savior, a robber baron, or something in between.